Mouthwashing is an indie psychological horror game about a crew of 5 people stuck on a spaceship, surviving off of little supplies and endless mouthwash after their captain crashed the ship. If you haven't played it already, I urge you to do so, as this game is only 2 hours long at most, but is an amazing experience from its story structure, sound design, and visuals. This video is meant for people who've already played the game, as I will not be providing a summary. Instead, I want to get straight into talking about Jimmy, Curly, their twisted friendship, and what you can learn from both of them. Jimmy and Curly are by far the most interesting characters to me. Jimmy's state of mind deteriorating throughout the game is really fun to see and dissect, but Curly left me with a couple questions until the end of the game. Did he know about the assault beforehand? Why didn't he punish Jimmy? Or at the very least stop him from going into the cockpit? And what was the point of all this? Going to the fandom for answers, I've seen many different takes on Curly. Some that completely villainize him, while others seem to understand but also misinterpret a few things from the limited dialogue. So with even more confusion than before, I decided to replay the game and pick it apart as best as I could. And I think the best place to start looking for answers would be this scene, where Anya reveals her pregnancy to Curly. A lot of people think that Curly knew about the assault before Anya revealed her pregnancy for multiple reasons. One of them being because Curly says, "This doesn't have to be on our performance log." But I think people misremembered this moment when using that as evidence, because this is specifically when Curly thinks Anya took the gun to hurt herself for being laid off. He knows that this is Anya's last job, that she doesn't have any savings, and Pony Express docks payment for poor team synergy. He's saying, "Hey, I'm not going to report you for this, let's just talk it out." The next reason is because of the line, "I told you." I think a lot of people, including myself, took this way too literally and assumed that Anya explicitly told Curly beforehand in a scene that we didn't see. But I realized later that's not what that line was referring to. It was referring to the dead pixel conversation they had. Anya pointing out the dead pixel and asking about why the sleeping quarters didn't have locks was her way of subtly telling him, but Curly, being the type of person who always looks at the bigger picture, didn't see the dead pixel. When Anya asked about the locks, he remembers that the cockpit has a lock for safety, and therefore thinks that's probably why the medical room has one too. It's not like anyone would hurt each other. They've all known each other for years at this point, minus Daisuke, but he's a nice guy. If you're still not convinced that this is what she meant, let me ask you this. If Anya directly told Curly that Jimmy assaulted her beforehand, and Curly didn't do anything about it, then why even bother trying to subtly tell him again afterwards? It logically doesn't make sense. Plus, I imagine going up to your captain/friend and saying, "Hey, by the way, your best friend of years is an asshole," to put it simply, isn't really an easy thing to do, which is a huge understatement. So back on track. When Anya reveals she's pregnant, Curly says, "Who would you?" As if to say, "Who would you sleep with?" Or something along those lines. This is a very blunt example. Meaning at this point, Curly thinks Anya consensually slept with someone. He still doesn't register that she was assaulted, because if he did, he'd probably say something closer to, "Who did this to you?" not "Who would you?" And when Anya says, "I told you," he finally connects the dots. This was why Anya didn't want to give him a psych eval. This is why she asked about the locks. He finally saw it. Jimmy was the dead pixel. She told him. I find it interesting how after this realization, instead of comforting Anya, he says, "Listen to me, we can fix this." Curly pauses before he says, "We can fix this," probably because he's in shock. And to cope with it, his brain immediately jumps to, "I can fix it." We know that from his psych eval, he doesn't really care about his mental health. Despite having trouble sleeping, spacing out, and possibly being depressed, he only cares that he's, quote, "good enough to fly in your eyes." To me, Curly has a mentality of, if I can still function, I am fine. He has this fix-it mentality that not only affects him, but also his friends. He does this to Anya and later on to Jimmy, and I don't think it's something people pick up on. I also thought it was super weird how when Curly cuts the birthday cake, he cuts the entire thing in half. It could just be for simplicity's sake or to mirror Jimmy cutting Curly's leg later on, but part of me thinks he might have been disassociating in that moment. It would also explain why when he confronts Jimmy about the pregnancy, he never directly answers anything. His mind is panicking when he tries to find him and falls back on the fix-it mentality and gets left completely stunned when Jimmy says, "I'll take care of it," only to snap out of it when it's too late. I love the music that plays right before this happens too. It's tense, it's loud. You as the player don't know what's about to happen, and neither does Curly. It also sounds like a fast and distorted heartbeat. A lot of people think this is Curly's rage, but I think this is his anxiety. So, Curly didn't know about the assault beforehand, and now we have an explanation as to why he didn't do anything when Jimmy went to the cockpit. But what about the time in between those two moments? Why didn't he do anything? Because he was in shock. The only thing he could really do at that moment was let Anya sleep at the cockpit or the medical room, and the fact that she mentioned she likes looking at the nighttime screen sometimes leads me to believe she already wasn't sleeping in her room anymore. And he could lock Jimmy in the cryopod until their transport was over, but I don't think he had the mental strength to do that. And he can't lock Jimmy in the medical room or the cockpit because the locks are from the inside. And realistically, Curly isn't gonna throw Jimmy out into space. He already knew beforehand that Jimmy isn't the most stable person since he struggled a lot back on Earth. And now he knows it's far worse than he thought. So he probably thought the best option would be to keep both parties calm until he figured something out. Which is why he gets frustrated when Anya says she told Jimmy about it. But there's something important I'm failing to ask here. How did Anya know that Curly wouldn't give her the gun to protect herself? Because she knows that just like her, Curly is also under Jimmy's control. I don't think people fully realize how bad Curly and Jimmy's friendship is, which is understandable since from an outsider view, they'd seem perfectly fine. But the way Jimmy talks to Curly stood out to me a lot on my replay. And I want to talk about this by showcasing how Jimmy switches between using I, we, and you when talking to him. Before Curly helps Daisuke and Swansea with the foam, Jimmy says maybe you should intervene, or we could just close the door. Your call. Basically saying, we could do this together, but it's entirely up to you. If you close the door and talk to Jimmy again, he'll say, much better if you ask me, but you should intervene still. Jimmy will switch between we and I to either bring attention to himself or to make himself look good next to Curly. I like it here. We're in control. We can be heroes. We fixed it. I fixed it. But once there's a problem, once there is blame to be pinned, and once someone has to take responsibility, he uses you. Leave the dirt behind now that your boots are clean. You were supposed to be the one who had everything under control. You said so yourself. This was your responsibility, Captain. Jimmy is very manipulative, and he even does this wordplay with Anya early in the game, when he mentions that they don't have a lot of painkillers left and says, but you still wanna, as if to say, but you still wanna keep Curly alive, pushing the idea onto Anya, not himself. When Curly opens up about his problems, Jimmy is surprisingly able to empathize with him, saying, so now you're thinking you might be on the wrong ladder altogether. And one sentence later, he says, while I'm still climbing and climbing. He was the one to ask Curly what was wrong, turn the attention to himself, and Curly almost immediately puts himself aside to comfort Jimmy. We know they've been friends for years, and I wouldn't be surprised if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And don't worry, it doesn't stop there, because good old Jambalaya then proceeds to bring up their private conversation when Curly breaks the news that they're being laid off, and twists his words to put everyone's frustrations onto Curly and guilt trip him. And wordplay aside, isn't it a bit weird how even though the party is meant for Curly, Jimmy is the one sitting at the head of the table? Jimmy clearly puts Curly on a pedestal in his mind, and yet he has no problem overstepping his boundaries. All I ever hear is how great of a leader you are. God, it's so annoying. And this is the second time he's mentioned this, the first time being in the psych eval. And I find this line really telling of his character because no one has ever said this to Curly. If anything, the others make it seem like it's more of a nuisance because they can't access basic tools or certain foods without codes that only the captain can access. But Jimbo over here is balls deep in jealousy that that's what he thinks. Jimmy is so incapable of seeing himself in a bad light that later when he takes the gun and sees Curly laughing at him for proving Anya right, he hallucinates Swansea attacking him. There's a lot of debate on whether or not Swansea chasing Jimmy was real, and I'd say no. Swansea knew hope was lost for a good while now, and when he gives his speech, he's untied and calm. I don't think he'd even have the heart to pull out the axe from Daisuke's face right after his death. It's more likely to me that Jimmy wanted to believe Swansea was lying, that he was a crazy killer, and that he had to fight him back and restrain him, that he didn't take an easy victory like a coward, and he was right to do what he did, when the reality was, Swansea probably just took a seat somewhere, saw Jimmy approach him, knew what was gonna happen, gave his final words, and went out quietly. When noticing that the drawer with the gun case was open, I thought Anya had opened it beforehand, failed to unlock the code, and left it. But I don't think she'd let Jimmy find it, even in death. I think when Swansea was looking for medicine for Daisuke, he found it accidentally and left it. There was nothing left to help Daisuke, and so he accepted their fate. Jimmy, Curly, and their friendship are really fun to think about for me, especially when almost all of Jimmy's guilt sequences involve him going back in some way, while Curly doesn't have the option to go back in his guilt sequence. He's stuck in an endless bloodbath. No matter where he turns to run, he's always moving forward. The warning signs and ladders are always right in front of him, the scorching sun rising ahead of him as he can't look away, symbolizing the crash. He can never go back. I'm also labeling this as a guilt sequence from post-crash Curly because I doubt that pre-crash Curly would have any reason to think about ladders or warning signs in that moment. I also want to make it very clear that when talking about Curly, I'm not in any way trying to downplay what happened to Anya or excuse Curly's actions. I'm trying to understand his actions, or rather his lack of action, especially with how differently people see his character. Simply hearing Curly is a bad person isn't satisfying to me, because he does care for his crew. Him being a pushover also isn't satisfying since we know he can easily put his foot down with Swansea, someone who's older than him. And obviously, I get why people would dislike or even hate him, and that is completely understandable. I realized while making this that part of why I like Curly so much is because he reminds me of myself when I was younger. Growing up, some of the friends I made weren't the best, to say the least. Obviously, they were nowhere near as bad as Jimmy, but they would do things that I knew were wrong, and I never went against them. In my mind, I just wanted to keep the peace, thinking that we could fix things together. They're my friend after all. Surely they're not a bad person. They just make mistakes sometimes, right? Looking back, I'm still a bit ashamed at my naivety, but I was a child. Curly, on the other hand, is not. He failed as a captain and as a friend to protect the others, and as a person, he failed to protect himself. So, everyone's dead. What was the point of it all? I think Curly and Jimmy, surprisingly, leave the audience with their own respective lesson. Curly teaches us that always trying to see the best in bad people will hurt not only you, but anyone around you. You can't be everyone's friend. Jimmy teaches us that even if a horrible person shows some guilt or remorse, they will never truly be able to change if they are blind to what they did. You need full awareness to take full... This game leaves you with so much dread, and I love it so much. 2 hours of gameplay and weeks after playing, it's still in the back of my mind. I love the visuals, how the story constantly jumps to different time periods, and the sound design is genuinely amazing. I'm really excited to see what the developers make next. But that's about all I wanted to say. Next video is definitely going to be art related, but until then, happy holidays, stay safe, have a great day or night, and thanks for watching. When we know from earlier in the game that When we know from earlier in the game that only Swansea and Anya's playlist survived the crash. Oh my fucking god.